right, well, hello everybody, and welcome to your Psych 121 course. This week we are talking about emotions and motivation. These are kind of some of the big kind of driving forces. We're looking at how do emotions kind of function in general, what's their use to us in daily life, and then also what about motivation? How do we engage in motivated behavior? What motivates us? And so we're going to be taking a look at what's the biological experience of emotion, some of the theories behind how emotion works, how we communicate through emotion, to kind of gain a little bit of an appreciation for how that looks within our daily life, and look at it across some different areas of functioning. And we'll talk a lot about, all of the factors that increase and don't increase happiness. And then we'll talk a lot about drive states. So, what are some of the biological goals that are accomplished through drive states? What are some of the neurobiological bases for these drive states? What are moderators and determinants of these things, such as hunger and arousal? And look at some antecedents and consequences of goal activation, and then the factors that influence motivation and course of goal pursuit. All right, so even though we are driven by things, we do know that not every response that we have is because of a drive. We know that or maybe to say that better, that there are different reasons or different factors that contribute to our drive. So we talk a little bit about this idea of intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. And so today, just by way of beginning, I'd like to read the U of S land acknowledgement. So as we engage in remote teaching and learning today, I'd like to acknowledge that the Saskatoon campus of the University of Saskatchewan is on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I'd also like to recognize that some may be attending this course from other traditional Indigenous lands. I ask that you take a moment to make your own land acknowledgement to the peoples of those lands. In doing so, we're actively participating in reconciliation as we navigate our time in this course, learning and supporting each other. So, when we are talking about emotion, we first have to talk a little bit about something called affect. And so, affect refers to our experience of feeling or emotion. So whenever we talk about emotion, we are again actually, or affect, we're talking about two components. So there's the emotion that we experience, and then there's also a motivated aspect to it as well. Now, both the emotions and the motivation involve arousal. And so arousal is how our body responds to both the emotions and the motivation. And so this happens within the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS. Now, emotions and motivations drive behavior and play an important role in everyday life. All right? So, when we talk about emotion, we're talking about a mental and a physiological feeling state that directs our attention and that guides our behavior. So, motivations are very closely related to emotions, and that's why in this chapter we're not treating them as separate things because they are so interconnected and they feed off of each other in many ways. However, when we're talking about motivation, we're talking about a driving force that initiates and directs behavior. And now these can include very basic motivations, so things like feeling hungry or needing water, but it can also involve personal and social motivations, so goals that we have that we'd like to achieve or relationships that we'd like to maintain or build. Now, one of the big questions is when we talk about emotions is this question: are emotions universal, or are these emotions things that vary tremendously between different countries or cultures or things like that? So in the research, we've kind of come up with this idea of what we call primary emotions and secondary emotions. I'll talk a little bit about primary first. So primary emotions are believed to be universal and are biologically based. And so when we talk about them, we usually talk about fear, anger, sadness, joy, surprise, disgust, shame, and embarrassment. So there's 8. There initially was kind of 4. Now we've kind of think maybe there's about 8. But the ones that for sure are all studies tend to agree would be fear, anger, joy, surprise, and disgust. That those are expressed the same way across all cultures. There is some evidence as well that pride could be another one that is kind of in there, but we're still kind of doing a little bit of research on that. Now, the basic emotions are determined in large part by one of the oldest parts of our brain. And so, since these are primarily evolutionary determined, the basic emotions are experienced and are displayed similarly across cultures. Now, this actually first came about through the work of Paul Ekman in the 1970s when he completed studies of emotions with a tribe that had very little influence from Western cultures. And I believe this tribe was based in Papua New Guinea. And so, we'll take a look at this gentleman. This was one of his examples. Now, what emotion is this gentleman sharing or displaying right now? Well, we would all agree that that looks like happiness, right? Joy. Okay, what about this one? Most of you would be saying to yourself, "Well, that looks like sadness." So, yeah, and you'd be correct. What about this one here? What do we kind of see here? Many people would say that what they're seeing is anger. And then finally, what about this one here? Most people would say that that is the look of disgust. And so these kind of primary studies led to kind of studies of, or to this conclusion that emotions seem to be fairly universal. And so study after study in different cultures and contexts have determined that the primary emotions seem to be very universal. However, secondary emotions, these are emotions that tend to be specific to a particular culture or that depend on what we kind of call cognitive complexity. So, for example, if we think of things like feeling frustrated or depressed or serene or amused, these would be secondary emotions that, in many cases actually are a bit of a blend of some of the primary emotions, but are also emotions that take a lot more, involve more cognitive complexity. It takes a lot more cognitive complexity to be able to put your finger on what frustrated looks at. Why is frustrated different just from straight angry, right? Why would serene be different from joy? Now, these emotions are made possible due to the cognitive interpretations that accompany emotions. And so that's what we talk about, this idea of cognitive appraisal. So while we experience emotions, the other part of what we do with emotions is we spend some time appraising how these emotions are kind of affect us. So, our experiences of the secondary emotions are determined in part by arousal and in part by their valence. And so, when we talk about valence in psychology, that is whether a feeling is pleasant or unpleasant. All right. So, not only just how aroused are we at that moment in time, but what is the valence? Is this a pleasant feeling for us or an unpleasant feeling? Now, there are three kind of main theories of emotion. And the first one is the Cannon-Bard theory. And Cannon-Bard said, basically the expression of an emotion is accompanied by physiological arousal. Okay, so the sequence is emotion and physical arousal are happening at the same time. So thus, as we become aware of danger, our heart rate also increases. So we experience the emotion alongside the arousal. Okay. Now, there is some support that's been found for this theory. So, we do know that emotions and arousal generally are subjectively experienced together, and the spread between both is very, very fast. So, to kind of give it to you in kind of a picture format, so let's say you see an oncoming car, all right? Well, Cannon-Bard would say that, you are both having the pounding heart and the fear at the exact same time, all right? So, the arousal and the appraisal are happening, the arousal and the emotion are happening at the exact same time. Okay. It's not the only theory, though. James Lang said that our experience of an emotion is actually the result of the arousal that we experience. So fear doesn't occur along, or sorry, fear does not occur along with the racing heart, but occurs because of the racing heart. So William James, back in 1884, he said, "We feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble." And so different patterns of arousal may then create different emotional experiences. That would be one of the conclusions that this theory kind of leads to. Now, there's some support for this theory as well. So we do know that arousal is necessary for the experience of emotion, and that the patterns of arousal are different for different emotions. So using the same kind of picture, James Lang would say, we've got the pounding heart, we've got the arousal, and that then leads to the fear. Okay? Now, the third theory, and the theory that probably, has been most well received, would be the Schachter-Singer theory of emotion. And so Schachter Singer's idea was that arousal that we experience is basically the same across all emotions, all right? So the experience of emotion is determined by the intensity of the arousal we're experiencing, but the cognitive appraisal of the situation determines what that emotion will be. So thus they've kind of said we've got two factors, right? We've got an arousal factor and a cognitive factor, which is why this is called the two-factor theory of emotion, okay? So for them, pretty simple. Emotion equals arousal plus cognition. All right. Now, there is some support for this theory. There's evidence that we may interpret the same patterns of arousal differently in different situations. In other words, context determines meaning. Now, if we look at Schachter Singer from this kind of perspective, they would say, okay, we've got the pounding heart, all right? We've got the cognitive label that says, I'm afraid. Both of those factors together lead to the emotion of fear. Now, we'll actually, just to take a quick little step back, we're going to talk a little bit about this when we talk about anxiety, because anxiety is a great example of how Schachter Singer's theory is validated by the experience of anxious people. So anyways, so just a little spoiler alert for coming up, but anyways, keep your eye on for that. Now, here's another thing that's kind of interesting is that studies have also kind of looked at, is it possible that we can incorrectly label the source of the arousal for a feeling that we're feeling? So there was a great little study that was done on the Capilano suspension bridge, and basically what they found was that the height of this bridge, right, for people who are kind of looking down, perhaps, I mean, it's pretty high up, and so you kind of have this, you're in an aroused state of some fear, and what they found that on the bridge they had a very attractive research assistant. And so and then at the bottom, after you've kind of crossed the bridge and you're kind of getting down, they asked people to kind of rate kind of their feelings at that moment in time. And so what they found was that people incorrectly labeled the feeling as attraction that they were experiencing instead of fear. So this kind of leads to an interesting thing that sometimes we may actually misattribute or misattribute feelings that occur in one situation for an emotion that it may not be kind of connected to. Now, for those of you who are old like me, perhaps you saw the movie Speed, right? And so I think it was Keanu Reeves, wasn't it? Anyway, so he and Sandra Bullock, I think they fall in love on the bus. But the whole kind of situation was, afterwards they kind of break up in Speed 2 because, they realized it wasn't actually love, it was fear that they were experiencing at the same time. Anyways, it's a great example of a movie of how kind of this misattribution of arousal could kind of happen or could look. So you're in a heightened arousal state and you misattribute those feelings to an incorrect emotion. Now, studies have also kind of shown that we can have something called excitation transfer. So, because the Schachter-Singer theory assumes that arousal is constant across emotions, it also predicts that emotions may transfer or spill over from one highly arousing event into another. So we call that excitation transfer. And so that's the phenomenon that occurs when people who are already experiencing arousal from one event tend to also experience unrelated emotions more strongly. Okay, so it's very similar to this misattribution, but in this particular case, we're not looking at kind of the cognitive appraisal of the emotion, we're just looking at what happens. Now, there's a really great example of this. So in 2011, there were these Vancouver riots, all right? So Stanley Cup, things are going wild. People were like super hyped up by the game, and they were going out and they were just trashing things. Okay, so that's an example of excitation transfer in and of itself, right? But then we have this beautiful photo here of this couple that in the midst of this craziness, they were just making out on the street. And so it made headlines, and everyone was like, what is going on? But this was a beautiful example of excitation transfer that was occurring in our own beautiful country, caught in picture for time immemorial, of how excitation transfer can actually look in the real life, in the real world. Now, when we talk a little bit about communicating emotion, we have to understand that we express our emotions to others and we learn about the emotions of other people by observing them, right? Now, this communication process is a very highly adaptive and also very highly evolved thing. And the main way that we communicate and the main way that we perceive the emotions of other people is through nonverbal communication, right? So nonverbal communication, not using any words, but it's things like body language, it's things like facial expression, it's reading the room, right? Now, the most important communicator of emotion is, not surprisingly, the face, right? That is where you can see what is going on and what the other person is going through. Now, this is not surprising because the face is also a highly developed instrument. I mean, it has 43 different muscles. It can make more than 10,000 unique configurations. It can express a wide variety of emotions. Now, in addition to helping us to express, the face actually also helps us to feel emotion. And so there's been this interesting series of studies about the facial feedback hypothesis. And so basically what this is it proposes that how we move our face can also help us to trigger corresponding emotions. So that is, if our facial expressions reflect one thing, our behavior will follow. So it's basically this idea of fake it till you make it. So if you are feeling, maybe you don't feel like smiling, but you begin to smile, eventually your body will kind of fall in line with that. So by manipulating by manipulating our face, we can actually also tell our face what it should be feeling. Interesting little thing. Now, just another little thing I want to touch on very briefly here before I kind of cap off this section and we move on to the next thing is, in addition to this idea of communication and emotions, one of the things that we kind of have to think about a little bit is lying, because lying is a complex um, component that is involved in communication of emotion. It's also involved in motivation. And so I'd like to talk for just a couple minutes about lying. To me, this is one of the more fascinating areas of psychology because we are all interested in catching liars, right? And in fact, most people out there will tell you that they are very good at catching people who are lying. And so most of us have a series of kind of tells, things we look for people that we know that a liar does, right? Or things that they don't do. So, one kind of tell that's a common kind of belief out there is that people who are lying, they don't look you in the eyes. They kind of look up to the right in a little bit, right? Or maybe they're kind of, kind of sweating, or maybe they look a little bit evasive or so forth. So we kind of have a whole bunch of ideas. Now, I'm going to tell you how you can actually spot a liar. And so when you get a little bit of chance, click on this Not Like This link, and it'll take you just to kind of a quick little 1-minute video about a great TV series based on lie detection that tells you how to not basically catch liars. But it's entertaining to watch. Now, the other thing that's very interesting is that, even for people who claim to have a natural ability to detect liars, the likelihood that they will successfully catch someone in a lie is about 50%. All right? That is equivalent to a coin toss. All right? Now, what do you think about people who are trained, like border protection agents and people like this? Well, even with training on lie detection, accuracy only increased to about 4%, to 54% accuracy. So what I'm going to tell you right now, which is not a super popular thing, is that teaching lie detection doesn't increase the odds of detecting a lie greater than chance. So there you go. So the tells of the human body, not super great. Well, what about polygraphs, right? Polygraphs, the universal lie detection machine, right? Well, here is a fun little fact about polygraphs. Polygraphs do not actually detect lying. Polygraphs detect arousal. What do I mean by that? Well, here's the thing. What is a polygraph measuring? A polygraph can't accurately say, this is a lie that you are telling me right now. What it detects is changes in heart rate. It detects changes in things like perspiration. It can detect those types of things. But here's the thing. You can also manufacture false positives just due to arousal. For someone who's really stressed out by taking a polygraph, it may seem like they're lying, even if they're not, simply because of arousal. The other side is true as well. You can actually generate a false negative if you know how to beat the polygraph. So polygraphs are not actually great at detecting lying. They are great at detecting arousal. All right. So thinking back to, when we're talking about the scientific method and reliability and validity, I mean, we've got to kind of look at both of those factors. First of all, is it reliable for measuring the same thing over and over? Well, if we're measuring arousal, then yes. Is it valid, though? Is it actually measuring what it's saying it is? Well, the answer would be a definite no. Well, maybe you're going to say, well, John, new technology. There's so much new technology out there that can help us to spot a liar. Well, here's the sad thing. So, there's been a kind of new computer voice stress analyzer. Studies are continually showing that that is also not being super helpful. Using high tech equipment like fMRI, also not super helpful. All right. Well, so what is the best method then? I need to know. All right, so here it is. All right. You want to know the best method to detect someone who's lying? Increase the liar's cognitive load. You're going to say, all right, John, that sounds important, but how do I do that? Well, here's one way. Ask them to tell the story backwards. Now, here's one of the things that you'll find is that liars tend to make more mistakes. For something that has happened factually, it is easy for us to tell it forwards and backwards. For something that has not happened factually, or not happened in the way that we, want to present it as having happened, it is increasingly more difficult to tell the story backwards. And so it creates and increases cognitive load, which then would actually kind of increase the number of errors. And so people who make more errors while telling the story backward are probably lying. So there you go. That's a free tip for you for parenting or relationshiping or anything. So enjoy that. I'm going to pause for here for now, and we will pick it up again in a little bit.